If there's any one thing that I see in all the guys that I work with in terms of sexual addiction and recovery and all that stuff, it's anxiety. Anxiety is absolutely everywhere. And if you know anything about our culture, you know that anxiety is everywhere for everyone. Although I think it's kind of interesting that with the advent of the sexual revolution, moving into the mass marketing of sexuality, moving into the reality of pornography in the home everywhere, like everyone's dealing with it. That level of saturation in this sexual mentality is right came right before this huge uptick in anxiety, and I think the two are connected. Frankly, I'm not sure entirely how connected, but I'm pretty sure they're connected. Certainly, they're connected for the guys I work with, and for entire slews of men who are trying to slog through this pornographic culture. So I want to talk about anxiety for a minute, and what I'd like to talk about as far as addiction goes is how addiction produces anxiety. I think that addiction is like an anxiety echo chamber. You know what an echo chamber is, right? It's where, you speak a sound or make a sound, and that sound goes around and around and around and around and around, and even seems to amplify. And that principle is really, really true in addiction. As you're acting out in addiction, the effects and the loudness of the anxiety gets bigger and bigger and bigger all the time, and it loops back on itself, because addiction in many cases, and I would say even in most cases, is a response to anxiety with a whole lot of other layers. I'm not pretending like it's only one faceted, but it's a response to anxiety, basically the anxiety we feel in life, and that could have many facets, but it's how we choose to medicate that anxiety on some level. Anxiety and fear, very closely related. I would probably say that fear is at the root, and anxiety would be kind of the practical felt effect of that fear, and then we solve that problem of fear and anxiety with acting out in some manner. And that can take a lot of forms and functions and that sort of thing, but that's the basic process. So it's an anxiety echo chamber. Addiction is an anxiety echo chamber. Let me hit you with just three areas. Let's talk about the physical, the emotional, and the spiritual side of this, and we'll just give one example for each, so hopefully you can grow a little bit in this. So anxiety is something that really lives in the body, and it's a part of the survival system. And if you do any work on sexual addiction recovery, you'll talk about survival systems all the time, because survival systems, they're the part of your body that's supposed to take over to keep you safe, and addiction grabs hold of that system and takes control of it, and so you end up feeling like two people in one person, and that second person is constantly looking for a way to be safe. That's it might seem like a little step to the left that we're like trying to be safe, but what I mean is the sense of needing to act out to feel better is that sense of needing to be safe or secure, this sort of thing. So as that's happening, we're having our body talk to us constantly, and this is where cravings come from. Cravings are anxiety in the body reaching out, trying to get us to do whatever our addiction is to solve the problem in the way the body has learned that. Think about what we're doing in addiction. We're doing something over and over and over and over again, and we're drilling it into our systems, and we're getting our mind all wrapped around it, and our mind shapes itself to those paths, right? And so if the body perceives that you need to go solve that problem, that you need to go act out, you need to feel safe again, if it decides that, it's going to start throwing an anxiety at you to hype you up and get you to the place where you'll go do that, because it thinks it's a need. It's like dying of thirst, So that's a crazy thing to experience, and it certainly feels powerful, and it feels guttural, and it feels hurtful. It feels bad in our very body. So we have these cravings until we act out. But what's crazy is that when we act out on those cravings, we do two things, at least two things. But here's two. One, we reaffirm the body's mindset. So the body learns by repetition. So if we do the thing, we end up affirming to our body that is what we should do to feel better when those conditions are in play. So you can see how that might be a problem, because we're reaffirming our need, want, our body's desire for the craving, whatever we act out with. On the other side, when we do that, we create a physical dependence on that thing. Now, one of the reasons why pornography in particular has become so rampantly addicted to in our culture is because pornography generates a synthetic level of dopamine in our mind. So when we're intimate with another person, there's a certain amount of pleasure chemical that would get released. Let's say we do that in a synthetic environment, like on a computer screen. We do that for hours on end. What we're seeing is more and more people are using pornography to a massive level before acting out finally an orgasm, that sort of thing. What that does is it creates a dependence on not just a natural form of the product, the chemical, but an unnatural level of it. Only through something like pornography can you get the kind of synthetic doses of this chemical that produce these physical changes. So that's crazy stuff. There's two physical things. So our physical anxiety creates the need to act out, and then acting out reaffirms the cravings and makes us dependent upon that synthetic level of dopamine. So let's talk about emotional anxiety real quick. So addiction is an anxiety echo chamber. It amplifies that sound. So on an emotional level, you can imagine that anxiety comes from a lot of root pieces of addiction, like a feeling of loneliness or hopelessness and this sort of thing. So we have these feelings. We have these feelings of maybe being numb or overwhelmed or gross or dirty, or there's a lot of ways to describe that. But at the root, we feel those in ourselves, in our bodies, of course, but like on an emotional level, we get really upset, and that upsetness comes with anxiety. As a matter of fact, I've met more people that can identify their anxiety than they can identify their upsetness. And if you go even higher than that, they can often identify their stress. They might be like, work is stressing me out, or my wife is stressing me out, or my kids are stressing me out. And underneath the word stress is anxiety, and then fears. And those fears are emotions like loneliness, or fear of rejection, or fear of failure, fear of imposter syndrome, like an imposter syndrome. All those emotional states exist underneath this thing. And so what's interesting is that as we experience the emotional side of anxiety, that anxiety constantly gets worse as we feed into our addiction. Now note, addiction for me is not something that, it's something we're doing over and over again. The rhythms could be very long, but we are doing it over and over again. We're going down the same path. If we're doing that, then our emotional state will develop a higher tolerance to the anxiety. What I mean is this. As the chemicals in our brain are flowing and doing their thing, we build up tolerance to them. So our body needs more of whatever the chemical is in order to get the same response out of our body. Now, emotionally speaking, what that means is that the anxiety lasts for a lot longer and must grow to a much higher level before the solution is found. Now, I don't have to tell you that this means that stopping an addiction earlier rather than later can be a really good thing. If you don't have help, get help today. Do it, because the walls that you're building against healing are only getting bigger, thicker, wider, stronger. And this is one of those areas where we end up trapped in this anxiety swell, which, let's be fair, can be nigh unbearable. Really, truly. Our bodies can give us emotions that are just beyond our wildest dreams in terms of intensity. And so the more engagement we have with an addictive rhythm, those emotions, because of the sense of tolerance, those emotions will be fed more and more as we have to be a part of the act and a part of the addiction more. So, anxiety just goes absolutely through the roof. As a matter of fact, I've seen a lot of guys that they almost can't even identify the anxiety because they are so overwhelmed with the emotion that their survival brain does something else. It shuts it down entirely. They go completely numb, disconnect from their emotions, and they lose emotional mobility. They lose the ability to express and engage with different emotions. They feel like a shell of a human being. And often it's this feeling of being numb, overwhelmed, and beyond that does that. Okay, so anxiety is addiction is an anxiety echo chamber. In this emotional sense, it just swells and swells and swells, and the next time, you might act out, and then the next time has to swell even bigger, act out, swells even bigger, to the point where you're debilitated by the emotional suffering that comes along with it. Now, I want to be clear. There's freedom. There's hope. You can change. I'm describing this, what sounds like a very overwhelming thing, but you can change. It's real. Jesus Christ is good. The Holy Spirit does his work, and we can change through the good discipline of God. But that doesn't mean that this reality isn't happening, where we get these huge swells of emotion, and it gets worse and worse over time. Lastly, I want to talk about how it's an anxiety echo chamber in terms of our relationship with God, the spiritual side of things. Now, a lot of people, particularly addicts, feel shame. And that shame compounds with the performing of a behavior that we know we ought not do. And it compounds even further in our subconscious, even if we rectify with it in our mind, or wrestle with it in our mind, and we feel like, oh, I've got this thing figured out, I'm not really that upset that I look at porn, blah, blah, blah. There's a part of us that knows we ought not be doing these things and stores the pain and the hurt. And that pain and hurt, and that connected back to that shame, makes us feel wrong with God. Well, what does that produce over time? Think about that. Most of the guys that I work with, they've been addicted for at least a decade. Those would be very low numbers, 10 years, right? Yeah. So if that's happening, if they're living in this addiction for at least a decade, what does that do to your spiritual self? Well, I know one thing it does. It makes you feel, it gives you what is called a shame mindset. You have a feeling that you are bad, you are unsavable, you are unapproachable, you are untouchable, you are the reason everything's messed up on some level, and you certainly don't feel right with God. You don't feel like God would want anything to do with you. And even if you start to approach that idea, a lot of believers will accept a sort of game. They'll play a game with God. And that game is something like, I'll go to church, I'll do the things or whatever, and I'm kind of hoping that if I put enough money in the offering plate, or if I sing my worship loud enough, or I cry enough, then I'll finally be acceptable to God. This is a horrible half-life to live. It's a life with the grace run out of it. And that is the practical effect of a shame mindset, is that real grace, real stunning, life-changing grace gets run out of the system. And so we have that constant feeling of being wrong with God. Well, you can imagine if somebody has the mindset that like one thing they did wrong made them wrong with God, what happens when that guy does 10 years of wrong? Right? And that's what his mind, because addictive creatures, man, that's what we're thinking about all the time. We're thinking about acting out or not acting out, or fighting it or not. And a lot of Christian men have been fighting it and fighting it and fighting it, and they just can't get there. That's how it feels anyway. And they've got this sense of like, I am fighting as hard as I can, and I just can't do it. And with that kind of logic, the anxiety grows and grows and grows. And it becomes more and more certain in one's mind that God cannot accept me. Oh, it's hard stuff. So addiction is an anxiety echo chamber in many ways. In the physical way, with cravings and this sense of dishevelment, in like literally, I've described it before, it's like vibrating due to anxiety. There's an emotional sense where we have to sustain these heightened states for longer periods of time. And then there's a spiritual sense where we feel as though we're truly unacceptable to God. And I am so glad that Jesus promises us that we are loved by him, that Paul points out that nothing can separate us from the love of God, and that all these horrible things we've done can be used for God's glory should we love him and be called according to his purpose. That's Romans 8:28, right? We've got lots of hope, but I hope you will start to identify if you're dealing with this anxiety thing on a really high level. Well, if you're dealing with it at all, but if you're dealing with it on a high level in particular, I hope that you'll start to understand that anxiety has multiple layers underneath it. And it is one of the pieces that is driving forward addiction. And if you want to get out of that, it's time to start dealing with anxiety through, well, there's a lot of ways, but we deal with it through self-care. We deal with it through reminding ourselves about truth and doing some cognitive behavioral stuff. We deal with it by putting boundaries into our life that keep us inside of God's promises so that we can experience what it's like to walk through the fire of anxiety and come out the other side okay. So there's a lot of really good stuff we can do there. And I hope that you will, if you need to deal with the anxiety that's going on in your life, I hope that you will come out of the shadows, talk to somebody, engage. You can, heck, connect with me. That'd be great. Or, let me get you to who you need as well. I'd love to resource you. Yeah. But if you're ready to deal with that, do that. Connect with somebody. Connect with a community. And start to heal from this thing that God can deliver you from. Okay, you're loved. Don't forget, and I hope to see you again. If you like this content, feel free to subscribe and like and all that stuff. Please leave me a comment down below. I'm looking to reply to more comments as of late. And I hope that you have an awesome day. You are loved.